It begins in the shadow of history, where names are lost to the winds of time, but this name, a singular, forgotten name, lingers still. Buried beneath layers of American history, hidden in the recesses of dusty archives and fading memories, was a literary giant whose voice once rang out, daring to challenge a nation, only to be silenced by it. This name, though, still carries weight, it just isn't carried by the hands of history anymore. For those who dare to remember, it's as if a ghost wanders through the pages of American literary history, its presence too haunting for the nation to fully embrace. But who was this figure, and how did they come to be erased? What crime did they commit to earn their place in the dark corners of forgotten legacy? The story begins with a name that was once on the lips of scholars, on the shelves of libraries, and among the most important voices in American literature. The black novelist who spoke truths so profound, so uncomfortable, that America couldn't allow their work to survive the passage of time. There were other writers, other voices of dissent and rebellion, but this writer's name, their work, carried an extra weight. They were not just a voice of protest or reflection, they were a living testament to the resilience of a people silenced for centuries. And yet, their name is almost unknown today. The irony of this erasure is too much to ignore. How could such an important figure have vanished from collective memory? How is it that the voices of those oppressed by slavery and racism, voices that documented, captured, and understood the experience better than anyone, are relegated to the margins of history? These questions linger, unsettling, as we begin to uncover the life of a writer whose contributions were deliberately obscured. The novelist's work was profound, their insights into the human condition sharper than any blade. Yet, their words were not given the space they deserved. In an era when the voices of the oppressed were often dismissed as unworthy or irrelevant, this writer's presence was a force to be reckoned with. They wrote about freedom, race, love, and loss, all themes that transcended their personal experience, striking a universal chord. And yet, there was a sense that this writer, despite their brilliance, was a thorn in the side of America's delicate cultural narrative. Their name was left out of anthologies, their books were quietly removed from libraries, and even when their works did survive, they were often dismissed as curiosities rather than masterpieces. But there is something chilling about this erasure, the sense that it wasn't merely an oversight, but an intentional decision to bury their legacy. The more we learn about this writer, the more it becomes clear that the erasure was part of something larger, something that transcended a simple lack of recognition. It was a systematic act of historical amnesia, a rewriting of the American story where only certain voices were allowed to shape the narrative. As the story unfolds, it's impossible to ignore the cold, unspoken truths. The writer's skin was black, and their voice too strong to be ignored. They were a force in a country that still grappled with its racist past, a past that was not so easily forgotten, no matter how much the nation tried. Their existence was inconvenient to the myth of a post-slavery America where racism had supposedly been vanquished, where equality had been achieved. This writer's life, their words, were a stark reminder that racial inequality was not just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing force that could not be wished away. In this opening section, we linger on the eerie, unsettling idea that this writer's name has slipped through the cracks of history. Even now, it seems improbable that such a rich literary legacy could simply vanish. There are moments where the writer's name, when it surfaces, feels like a fleeting whisper, and the audience is left to wonder, why is it so easy to forget? What kind of power, what kind of fear, would make an entire society erase someone's contributions so thoroughly? Through a series of reflections and haunting insights into the past, the tone shifts from historical curiosity to something more emotional, even personal. The audience begins to feel the weight of this erasure, as if a piece of the nation's soul has been taken and hidden from sight. The novelist's absence from the annals of American literature is not just an academic failing, it is a moral one. The emotional resonance of this injustice settles into the viewer's consciousness, as we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that history, as it's been written, is a narrative shaped by power. And those who hold power have always known the importance of silencing the voices they fear. But this erasure is not permanent, and the journey we take through this story will uncover more than just a forgotten name. It will reveal the forces that sought to silence it, the battles fought and lost to keep this writer from being remembered, and the eventual emergence of their work from the shadows. The question that remains, of course, is whether the writer's legacy can ever be fully reclaimed, or whether it is doomed to remain a ghost, a lingering presence in a nation that still refuses to confront its past in full. What follows is a story not just about a black writer, but about a nation struggling with its own identity, its own fractured relationship with race, and the uncomfortable truths that remain buried in its history. This isn't just the story of one person, but of a people, and a culture that has consistently overlooked or erased their contributions. Yet, even in the face of this erasure, the writer's story endures, not just in the pages of forgotten manuscripts, but in the very act of questioning why history has been so eager to forget. And so, with this question in mind, the journey begins, to uncover the name, the life, and the work of the black novelist who America pretended didn't exist. Mississippi, a land where the ghosts of the past linger long after the battles have been fought, where history is not a distant memory but an ever-present force shaping the present. The story of this novelist begins here, in the heart of the South, in a place defined by its tragic history of slavery, violence, and racial division. For in the fertile soil of Mississippi, where cotton once grew on the backs of enslaved laborers, the seeds of a literary legacy were planted in the most unlikely of places, in the heart of a young black child born to the hardships of a nation that would never fully embrace their humanity. The story of this writer cannot be understood without first understanding the deep scars left by slavery in Mississippi. The state, even after the Civil War, was a land marred by the remnants of an institution that had brutalized generations. Slavery, with its cruelty and systemic oppression, left a cultural and psychological imprint that would not fade easily. The novelist's very existence, born into this turmoil, was an anomaly in itself. They were not supposed to be here, not supposed to have a voice, not supposed to contribute to the very culture that had worked so tirelessly to keep them silenced. Yet here they were, standing in defiance of a history that had been written to exclude them. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Mississippi was a state struggling to rebuild, to heal the wounds of a society that had been torn apart by years of bloodshed and division. But this was not a healing process defined by reconciliation. Instead, it was a process of reconstruction, a word that itself carried heavy weight. Reconstruction meant new systems of control, new methods of oppression, and the continuation of the same racial divides that had always existed. While the abolition of slavery was supposed to herald a new era, the reality was far darker. Black individuals in Mississippi found themselves trapped in a world where freedom was elusive, and where the legacy of slavery lived on in the form of segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. Amidst this environment, the writer's early years were shaped by a stark contrast between the poverty and deprivation of their community and the dreams of possibility that education promised. It was a time when access to education for black children was sparse, often restricted to basic literacy and rudimentary skills. However, in the face of these odds, the writer's desire to learn burned bright. In a society that valued black lives only for the labor they could provide, the idea of a black person pursuing knowledge, of rising above their station to achieve something greater, was not just rare, it was radical. But it was this very radicalism that would fuel the writer's passion for literature, for expression, and for understanding the world that had shaped their existence. Education, in the context of post-slavery Mississippi, was both a privilege and a danger. For a black child to be taught to read and write was to gain the tools to resist the very system that sought to suppress them. It was a quiet rebellion, an act of defiance that would haunt the minds of those who upheld the old ways of life. The writer, like so many others, learned in secret, grasping at the fleeting moments of opportunity to better themselves. They learned to read, not just for knowledge, but for liberation. They read books that had been denied to them, they read words that carried the weight of generations, and they read for the simple reason that to read was to understand, to see the world for what it truly was. But even as the writer's thirst for knowledge grew, the world around them remained as unforgiving as ever. Mississippi, even in the late 19th century, was still a place where black people were not fully free. Laws, customs, and violence conspired to keep black individuals in a state of perpetual subjugation. The plantation economy may have collapsed, but the social hierarchy it had built was still in full force. The black community in Mississippi, though free from the chains of enslavement, was still bound by the invisible chains of racism, prejudice, and a society that refused to accept them as equals. The writer's early life, shaped by the contradictions of freedom and oppression, would play a critical role in the stories they would later tell. They understood the weight of history, the burdens of the past, and the limitations placed on the lives of those like them. Yet, in the face of these overwhelming forces, they found their voice. It was a voice forged in adversity, honed in the quiet moments of reflection and rebellion that came with each word they read, each book they devoured. While Mississippi remained a place of hardship, it was also the birthplace of a unique cultural legacy. It was a place where music, literature, and folklore blended into something uniquely American. But the culture that emerged from Mississippi was one defined by pain, by trauma, and by the persistence of an unjust system. The writer, like so many others, was forced to navigate this space, to exist in a world that saw them as inferior, yet possessed a story that demanded to be told. In a society that sought to erase their identity, their very existence was an act of resistance. This section of the story delves into the emotional and psychological landscapes that defined Mississippi during the post-slavery era. It's a place where the legacies of the Civil War and the institution of slavery cannot be ignored, where every corner of the state carries the weight of history. As we learn more about the writer's upbringing, it becomes clear that their identity was shaped by the cruel contrasts of Mississippi. They were born into a world of brutal injustice, yet somehow they grew into a voice that refused to be silenced. It was a world that tried to hold them back at every turn, but they reached for something higher, something more than what was given to them. In this environment, the novelist's success was not just improbable, it was revolutionary. Their mere existence, their ability to write and to be heard, challenged the fundamental assumptions of a society that had spent centuries denying them the right to live freely, to think freely, to create. And as we explore the novelist's early life and the world they came from, the emotional weight of this struggle becomes clear. It's a story not just of one person, but of an entire people fighting to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. The tension between the writer's desire for education and the oppressive forces that surrounded them creates a narrative filled with struggle and triumph. Mississippi, a place both beautiful and brutal, serves as the backdrop to a story of defiance and survival. In this harsh landscape, the writer would not only survive, but they would thrive, using the very tools that had been denied to them to carve out a place in history. But the question remains, would their contributions be enough to change the course of history, or would they too be buried in the sands of time, forgotten by the nation that never fully embraced them? The first chapters of this novelist's life are written not in books, but in the harshest realities of Mississippi's post-slavery landscape. Born into a world where freedom was a fragile concept, their existence began not with opportunity, but with hardship, the unyielding, suffocating weight of a system that had once defined their life as property. For the writer, the first pages of their story were marked by the trauma of enslavement. But within the violence of their world, a flame of hope began to flicker, however faintly. The story of their rise from the shackles of enslavement to the heights of literary achievement was not a tale of sudden revelation, but of patient, quiet resistance. Mississippi, in the years following the Civil War, was a place where freedom for black people was still a distant dream. The legacy of slavery loomed large, its shadows stretching over everything. The black community, once relegated to a life of forced labor, now found themselves in a state of uncertain liberty, where even basic rights were often denied. But for this young child, the idea of freedom carried with it a sense of something more profound, not just physical liberty, but the freedom to think, to learn, to imagine a life beyond survival. Education in the South for black children was a luxury few could afford. The state of Mississippi, in particular, offered little to no resources for the education of black children, especially those born into families who were still struggling to recover from the brutalities of slavery. The idea that a child like the writer, born into a world of poverty and racial prejudice, could achieve anything resembling an education seemed implausible. Yet, it was within these constraints that the writer's ambition was born. They knew that knowledge was the key to unlocking a world beyond the limits that society had placed upon them. Despite the oppressive atmosphere that defined their early years, the writers' thirst for knowledge could not be extinguished. They sought out every opportunity to learn, even if it meant learning in secret. Education was not a simple privilege, but a dangerous act of defiance. In a world where literacy among black people was seen as a threat to the social order, even the act of reading a book or writing a sentence could be dangerous. For the writer, this act of learning was both revolutionary and necessary. It was their way of asserting their identity, of refusing to be defined by the system that had once held them captive. This section of the story delves into the complexity of growing up in a time when education was both a beacon of hope and a tool of resistance. The writer did not have access to formal schooling in the traditional sense, yet they found ways to educate themselves. They sought out whatever materials they could find, from the Bible to scraps of newspapers, to gain a sense of the world beyond their immediate surroundings. These humble beginnings, a child with no formal access to education, living in a community that had long been denied the tools for intellectual growth, became the foundation of a self-made scholar. As the writer grew, so too did their understanding of the world. Theirs was a mind that refused to be contained by the limitations of their circumstances. Even in the midst of physical deprivation and social exclusion, the writer found a space within themselves where the seeds of intellectual curiosity could take root. These formative years were filled with contradictions, moments of crushing poverty balanced by bursts of intellectual freedom, a hunger for knowledge that could not be satisfied by mere survival. The writer's early life was also marked by their deep connection to the stories of their ancestors, stories passed down orally through generations of black families who had survived enslavement. These stories were rich with wisdom, resilience, and the subtle subversiveness of those who had lived under the weight of oppression. It was from these stories that the writer would draw much of their inspiration, seeing in them not just the history of their people, but the raw materials of their own future as a storyteller. They understood that in a world that had worked so hard to suppress the voices of black people, these stories were sacred. They were not only a way of preserving history, but a way of reclaiming the narrative, of ensuring that their people's truth would be heard. The struggle for education, for literacy, was not without its dangers. The writer faced harsh realities as they navigated the world of post-slavery Mississippi. The town where they lived was still steeped in racial tension, and black people were often targeted by those who sought to uphold the old ways of segregation and white supremacy. Yet the writer persisted, determined not only to survive but to transcend the circumstances of their birth. They became a self-taught scholar, finding inspiration in the works of others who had struggled to overcome oppression. Books became their sanctuary, their escape, and their source of strength. As the writer entered their teenage years, the world around them became both a place of increasing opportunity and a reminder of how deeply the racial divide shaped every aspect of life. While their education had equipped them with the tools to understand their place in a world that sought to deny them their humanity, it also opened their eyes to the deep injustices that still existed. The writer could no longer simply accept the world as it was. They had been taught to question it, to see the lies woven into the fabric of society, to challenge the assumptions that held black people in a perpetual state of inferiority. In these years, the writer's passion for literature began to crystallize. They were drawn not just to the works of their own time, but to the classics, the histories, and the philosophical works that transcended race and class. The writer was a student of both the written word and the world itself. They began to write, not just as an act of self-expression, but as a means of navigating the complexities of their identity. Through their writing, they could escape the confines of Mississippi, transport themselves to places of freedom, and at the same time, confront the harsh realities of the world they lived in. By the time the writer reached adulthood, they had become a skilled and passionate writer, their work infused with the experiences and insights gained from their difficult upbringing. It was during this time that they began to share their stories, first with a small group of like-minded individuals, and eventually with the world. But the journey from the quiet corners of Mississippi to the national stage was not an easy one. The writer had to navigate a world that was not eager to embrace their voice, a world that was still deeply divided along racial lines. Despite the challenges, the writer's early life served as the bedrock upon which their later success would be built. The experiences of their childhood, the struggles for survival, the thirst for knowledge, and the desire to reclaim their history, would shape the themes of their work for years to come. In a society that sought to silence their voice, the writer had found a way to rise above. They had learned the lessons of resilience, of resistance, and of the importance of storytelling. These lessons would not only define their own life, but would go on to shape the course of American literature itself. Through their journey, we see how education became the key to unlocking the writer's potential, a symbol of freedom in a society that sought to keep them in the shadows. It was in the pursuit of knowledge that the writer found both their voice and their place in history. Their story, from the harshness of enslavement to the triumph of intellectual independence, is a testament to the power of education as a tool of liberation. As the years passed and the writer's education deepened, so too did their understanding of the world around them. The quiet rebellion of learning in secret, of teaching themselves the forbidden arts of writing and literature, began to bear fruit. What had started as a solitary journey of self-empowerment blossomed into something much more. The writer's voice, once stifled by the oppressive walls of Mississippi's racial climate, began to rise. Their words would not be silenced. In fact, they were just beginning to echo across the boundaries that had been carefully constructed to keep them in their place. By the time the writer began to share their work publicly, they had already become a powerful force. The words they crafted were imbued with the experiences of a lifetime spent navigating a world defined by racial injustice, poverty, and exclusion. Yet, unlike so many before them, this writer was not content to simply recount their struggles. Their writing was sharp, incisive, and, above all, defiant. They did not simply write for catharsis, they wrote to challenge, to provoke, and to reshape the narrative. Their voice was unlike anything the literary world had yet encountered. It was raw, authentic, and above all, it was unapologetically black. The writer's early works were received with mixed reactions. In some circles, their literary prowess was immediately acknowledged and praised. Their words carried a weight that resonated deeply with those who understood the true cost of racism and the lasting scars of slavery. Their writing spoke directly to the heart of the black experience in America, capturing the nuances of identity, freedom, and the search for justice. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, one that could not be ignored or dismissed. Yet, this writer's rise to literary prominence was not without resistance. In a country still reeling from the wounds of its past, the success of a black writer was a direct challenge to the status quo. For many in the established literary community, this writer's work was not just an anomaly, it was a threat. To embrace their words would be to acknowledge that the history of slavery and the brutal realities of racial inequality were not just relics of the past. It would force America to confront its uncomfortable truths, truths that the nation had worked so hard to suppress. In response, some critics chose to dismiss the writer's work as irrelevant, labeling it as niche or unworthy of serious consideration. Others sought to marginalize their contributions, relegating their writing to the fringes of literary circles. But for every critic who sought to undermine their voice, there were others who saw the brilliance in what they had written. The writer's work began to attract a growing following, particularly among those who had long been silenced, black readers, activists, and intellectuals who saw in this writer's words a reflection of their own struggles. They had found a voice that spoke not just for them, but to them, articulating the realities of a black existence in a way that had never been done before. The writer's words were not simply stories, they were acts of resistance, defiance against a system that sought to erase the voices of those deemed unworthy. As the writer's reputation grew, so too did the intensity of the backlash. The very success they had worked so hard to achieve now became a source of danger. The writer's work, once celebrated for its authenticity, was now under scrutiny by those who feared what it represented. The establishment was no longer content to simply ignore the writer's existence, they sought to actively suppress it. Publishers who had once shown interest in their works withdrew in the face of growing criticism. Critics, many of whom were staunchly entrenched in the prevailing white narrative of the time, attacked the writer's work as divisive and dangerous. Despite these challenges, the writer remained steadfast in their mission. They knew that to write was to wield power, and they were not about to let that power be taken from them. Every word they wrote became an act of defiance against the system that had sought to silence them. The writer's pen was their weapon, and they used it with precision and purpose, each stroke challenging the very fabric of a society that had spent centuries dehumanizing their people. This section of the story is marked by the writer's struggle to assert their place within a literary tradition that had long been dominated by white voices. The writer's work was not merely a contribution to the literary canon, it was a revolution. In a world that had denied them a seat at the table, the writer was carving out their own space, a space that would not be denied. Their words, which began as a whisper in the corners of Mississippi, were now being heard by a wider audience, and the impact of their writing began to resonate far beyond their immediate environment. As the writer's influence grew, so too did the sense of urgency in their work. Their early writings, while groundbreaking, were only the beginning. With each new work, the writer pushed further into uncharted territory. They wrote not just about the black experience, but about the larger issues of justice, freedom, and the moral contradictions of a nation that claimed to stand for equality while perpetuating systems of oppression. The writer's work became more daring, more confrontational, and more politically charged. They were no longer content to merely reflect the world around them, they were seeking to change it. At the heart of this rise to prominence was the writer's refusal to be confined by the limitations imposed upon them. Their journey from Mississippi to national recognition was marked not just by a growing body of work, but by a relentless drive to push boundaries, both literary and societal. Every novel, every essay, every poem was a challenge to the idea that a black person could not rise to greatness. With each new publication, the writer solidified their place as one of the most important voices of their generation, a voice that would not be silenced or diminished. However, as the writer's literary career flourished, so did the sense of isolation that came with it. The writer's success was bittersweet, for it was a success that came at a great personal cost. The very same society that had rejected them as a child now sought to co-opt their work for its own purposes. The writer had always understood that their success would come with a price, but nothing could have prepared them for the weight of that price. As their work gained recognition, so too did the pressure to conform, to tone down their message, to fit into the mold that had been created for them. The tension between artistic integrity and commercial success became a constant battle, one that threatened to consume the writer. Would they remain true to the radical, revolutionary ideas that had defined their early work, or would they bend to the pressures of the literary world, who sought to commodify their experience? The writer's rise to prominence was not without its sacrifices, and these sacrifices would come to define much of their later years. Yet, despite the personal toll of their success, the writer continued to produce work that was groundbreaking, controversial, and undeniably important. Each new book, each new article, was an affirmation that their voice would not be silenced. Their rise was not just a personal victory, it was a victory for every black person who had ever been told that their voice didn't matter. It was a triumph over the systemic forces that had sought to keep them in the margins, and it was a testament to the power of the written word to challenge the status quo. By the time the writer reached the height of their career, they had become more than just a literary figure, they had become a symbol of resistance, of the indomitable strength of the human spirit, and of the power of a single voice to change the course of history. Just as the writer had begun to find their voice and claim their place in the literary world, the forces that sought to silence them began to close in. The rise of their prominence was no longer a cause for celebration, but a source of growing anxiety. The very success they had worked so tirelessly for, the recognition, the acclaim, suddenly became a double-edged sword. With each new work that reached the public, the backlash grew stronger, more pointed, more deliberate. The writer's refusal to conform, their insistence on speaking truths that others were too afraid to acknowledge, made them a target. The world they had once sought to engage with now became a hostile and dangerous place. It was no longer just about publishing books, it was about survival. In the early years, the writer had been celebrated as a rising star, a voice that represented not just the black experience, but a universal struggle for justice and truth. Their works were heralded as groundbreaking, important, and profoundly relevant to the time. But as their visibility grew, so too did the discomfort they caused. Their very existence, as a black intellectual who dared to speak truth to power, challenged the established norms of the literary world. It wasn't just their work that was controversial, it was their very being. In a nation still deeply divided by racial lines, the idea of a black writer gaining prominence, particularly one who so boldly addressed the racial inequities of America, became intolerable for those in power. The backlash started slowly at first, a few critical reviews, a few dismissive comments from established figures in the literary world. But as the writer's success expanded, so did the scope of the criticism. The attacks were no longer just about their work, but about their character, their very right to exist as a public figure. It was no longer enough to be a talented writer, the writer had to fit into a certain mold, one that adhered to the racial and social expectations of the time. And the writer refused to do so. Their very presence in the literary world was a threat to the status quo, and the status quo would do everything in its power to push back. At first, the writer was able to weather the storm. They continued to write, continued to speak, continued to challenge the system. But as the personal attacks grew more vicious, the toll on the writer's psyche became impossible to ignore. The pressure to maintain their place in the public eye, to keep producing work that was both relevant and radical, began to take its toll. The weight of representing an entire marginalized group became a burden too heavy to bear, and the writers started to retreat. Their public appearances became fewer and fewer. They stopped attending literary events, stopped engaging in the intellectual debates they had once been so eager to join. What had once been a source of joy and purpose had now become a trap, a source of anxiety, and a constant reminder of how precarious their position was. It was during this period of retreat that the writer began to question their place in the world of literature. The rejection was no longer just from critics, it was from an entire system that seemed determined to erase them. The very acts that had once been celebrated, their defiance, their boldness, their unwavering stance against oppression, now seemed like liabilities. The writer began to wonder if they could ever truly be accepted, if their work would ever be seen for what it was, a profound contribution to American literature, to history, to humanity. Instead, they were being marginalized, dismissed, even vilified. The dream of reaching a wider audience, of having their voice heard, now seemed like an impossible task. The isolation that followed was not just a physical withdrawal from the public eye, but a psychological retreat into a place of deep reflection and self-doubt. The writer questioned the worth of their work, the value of their voice in a world that had not only rejected them but had actively sought to silence them. The more the writer retreated into this mental space, the more the silence around them grew. Their absence from the public stage, once a temporary reprieve, became permanent. The writer had once been a fixture in the literary world, now, they were a ghost, a shadow of the figure they had once been. The emotional toll of this silencing was profound. What had begun as a career built on passion, on the belief that their work could change the world, now felt like a hollow pursuit. The writer had given everything to their craft, their voice, their time, their energy, only to be cast aside by those who feared what they represented. The very act of writing had become a painful reminder of their rejection, a cruel twist of fate for someone who had once been hailed as one of the greatest literary talents of their time. Yet, even as the writer withdrew from the world, their work continued to resonate with a select group of readers. It was as if their voice, once silenced by the mainstream literary establishment, found its place in the underground currents of thought. Scholars and activists, individuals who saw the power of the writer's words and understood the deep truths embedded within them, continued to seek out their work. These readers, though few in number, became the writer's most loyal supporters. They understood that the writer's voice was not just a voice of rebellion, but a voice of hope, a voice that could still speak truth to power, even in silence. Despite the growing isolation, the writer's influence remained. The silence surrounding them only deepened the mystery of their life and work. It was as if the more the writer was pushed into the shadows, the brighter their legacy burned. Their works became rare treasures, highly sought after by those who understood their importance. Yet the larger literary world, the world that had once embraced them, seemed to have moved on, forgetting or deliberately ignoring the writers' contributions. It was as if their disappearance had been carefully orchestrated, a deliberate effort to erase them from the cultural consciousness. In this moment of silencing, the writer found themselves at a crossroads. Could they continue to live in the shadows of their own past, never to be fully acknowledged or celebrated? Or would they find the strength to break free, to reassert their place in the literary world? The question remained unanswered, for the writer's withdrawal from public life became, in many ways, permanent. Their contributions to literature and to the culture at large were slowly being forgotten, and with each passing day, it seemed more unlikely that they would ever be given the recognition they so rightly deserved. In the end, this section is a meditation on the cost of speaking truth to power. The writer's story is not just about literary achievement, but about the emotional and psychological toll of fighting against a system that refuses to acknowledge your humanity. It is about the silent struggle that takes place when the world you hoped would embrace you instead seeks to silence you, when the very act of living your truth becomes an act of resistance, one that can only be sustained for so long. The writer's silencing is not just a personal tragedy, it is a reflection of the larger forces at play, forces that seek to control the narrative, to suppress uncomfortable truths, and to erase voices that challenge the status quo. As the years passed and the writer's retreat from the public eye deepened, the absence of their voice began to speak volumes. Their silence became a form of protest, an act of resistance against a literary establishment that had both celebrated and rejected them. Yet, as time wore on, the question remained, could their legacy survive this silencing? In a world that had long ignored the contributions of black writers, the writer's retreat was not just personal, but symbolic. They had become a casualty of a system that was determined to ignore the voices of those it deemed unworthy, even if those voices were the most profound and challenging the country had ever known. The fight for legacy is an exhausting and often invisible battle. It is a fight that takes place not just in the public sphere but within the very hearts and minds of those who are overlooked, erased, and forgotten. For the writer, the struggle was one that transcended mere recognition. It was about the very act of being seen, of having their work acknowledged as a vital part of the cultural landscape. Yet, the more they withdrew, the more it seemed as though their work would be relegated to the fringes, never to be fully recognized or understood. But even in the face of this erasure, the writer's legacy began to take root in unexpected places. While the literary world turned its back on them, the writer's words found new homes in the hearts of those who had been directly impacted by the struggle for justice and equality. The writer's work, though largely forgotten by mainstream academia and the publishing world, continued to speak to those on the front lines of the fight for civil rights. Activists, community leaders, and everyday people who understood the struggles of black life in America found solace and strength in the writer's words. These readers, often from marginalized communities, became the keepers of the writer's legacy, even as the world seemed determined to forget it. The writer's words were no longer just literature, they were a rallying cry. They were a reminder of the power of the individual to stand against the tides of history, to challenge a society that sought to subjugate them. In a time when black voices were often dismissed as irrelevant or dangerous, the writer's work offered a vision of resistance, one that spoke not only to the social and political realities of the moment but also to the very essence of what it meant to be free. The writer's stories, though often filled with pain, also carried a sense of hope. In their prose, there was a belief that change was possible, that the struggle for equality and justice was not futile but necessary. These ideas became a lifeline for many during a time of social upheaval, and in many ways, they planted the seeds for the movements that would define the next era. Despite their physical absence from the literary scene, the writer's influence was being felt in new and profound ways. The Black Power movement, which emerged in the 1960s, found echoes of its own struggles in the writer's work. The civil rights movement, too, could trace its roots back to the defiant words of a black writer who had dared to challenge a system built on racial oppression. These movements were not just political, but deeply cultural, rooted in the belief that the voices of black people deserved to be heard, that their stories were essential to the narrative of America itself. And the writer's work, though largely ignored by the broader literary world, was a foundational part of that narrative. As the years passed, the writer's name, though still rarely mentioned in academic circles, began to emerge in new contexts. Scholars who were interested in the intersections of race, power, and literature began to look back at the writer's work with fresh eyes. They began to understand that the writer's absence from the canon was not a simple oversight, it was a deliberate act of erasure. This new generation of scholars, many of whom had been inspired by the social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, started to reclaim the writer's place in history. They understood that the writer's contributions to literature were not just important in their own right, but also essential to understanding the complex dynamics of race and power in America. The struggle for legacy, however, was far from over. The writer, though no longer active in the public eye, continued to fight for recognition, if not through their words, then through the growing body of work that their life and legacy had inspired. The fight was no longer just about the writer, it was about ensuring that future generations would not forget the essential contributions of Black artists and thinkers. The writer's fight for recognition became emblematic of a larger struggle, one that sought to confront the historical erasure of Black voices and contributions. This was a fight for the right to be remembered, for the right to be included in the narrative of American history. But even as their work began to receive renewed attention, the writer's life remained shrouded in mystery. The reasons for their retreat from public life were never fully understood. Some believed that the writer had simply grown disillusioned with the literary world, while others speculated that the personal toll of their rise to fame had been too much to bear. But the truth, as it often does with such figures, was more complicated. The writer's withdrawal from the public stage was not just an individual decision, it was a reflection of the systemic forces that sought to erase them, to silence them, to render their contributions invisible. It was a form of cultural exile, one that had been imposed upon them by a world that could not handle the truths they had exposed. Even so, the writer's absence from the public stage did not mean that their influence had waned. The fight for recognition continued, albeit in a different form. Those who had once been inspired by the writer's words began to pass that inspiration on to others. Through oral histories, through the publication of new editions of the writer's work, and through the tireless efforts of those who had never forgotten the importance of the writer's voice, the struggle for legacy persisted. But legacy, as this writer's life would prove, is a complicated thing. It is not simply about fame or recognition, it is about the ongoing impact of one's work on the world. The writer's legacy was not dependent on their inclusion in the official literary canon, it was shaped by the lives they touched, the minds they influenced, and the generations they inspired. Even in silence, their words continued to reverberate, offering a challenge to anyone willing to listen. This section reveals the complex relationship between the writer and the cultural landscape they inhabited. It is about the power of legacy, not as a static, easily defined thing, but as something that evolves, grows, and resists. The writer's struggle for recognition becomes a metaphor for the larger fight for visibility and voice in a world that has long sought to erase the contributions of marginalized groups. Despite the erasure of their name from mainstream history, the writer's influence was undeniable. They had become a symbol of resistance, not just for Black Americans, but for anyone who has ever been silenced, ignored, or made invisible. Their struggle for legacy was not a quest for personal glory but a fight for justice and recognition in a world that had too long refused to see their worth. The legacy of the writer, long silenced and pushed to the periphery of American literary history, had begun to take on a life of its own, but it was a legacy defined by absence. As time wore on, the writer became a shadow, an elusive figure whose work was revered by a select few but largely ignored by the masses. The story of their life, of the struggle that had shaped their identity and their writing, was at risk of being lost in the cracks of history. And yet, this very absence, this almost spectral existence, became part of the narrative of their legacy. The writer's struggle was not just about being heard, it was about being remembered, about ensuring that their contributions to the cultural landscape of America would not be erased. What makes a legacy truly lasting? Is it the number of accolades, the citations in academic journals, or the inclusion in textbooks? Or is it something more elusive, something quieter and more organic, the way a writer's words linger in the minds of those who have read them, the way those words continue to shape thought long after the writer is no longer present. For the black writer whose name had once been at the forefront of literary circles, legacy became a matter of endurance, of persistence, even in the face of near-total erasure. It was a struggle not only for recognition in the canon but for the survival of their voice in a society that had long tried to suppress it. As the decades passed, the writer's absence from the public eye became a source of deepening mystery. Was this disappearance intentional? Had the writer withdrawn voluntarily, disillusioned by the rejection they had faced, or was their silence a consequence of a deeper societal failure, a failure to sustain the visibility of black voices in the broader cultural conversation? The truth is that both aspects played a role. The writer had retreated not just because of the rejection they had endured, but because of the deeper, more pervasive forces at play. They had written for a world that was not ready to listen, for a world that had no place for the voices of black writers unless those voices were carefully contained, carefully controlled, and, in many cases, relegated to the margins. The erasure of the writer from mainstream historical memory was not simply a result of personal rejection, it was a consequence of systemic racism, a deliberate attempt to suppress the intellectual and cultural contributions of black people. The struggle for recognition, then, was not just about one writer's desire for fame or acknowledgement, it was about a larger societal failure to recognize the value of black intellectualism, art, and culture. The writer's work was ignored, not because it was unworthy, but because it challenged the very structure of a society that sought to marginalize the voices of the oppressed. This struggle for memory, for legacy, takes on a different dimension when we consider the broader context of racial history in America. The writer's erasure is not an isolated incident, it is part of a much larger pattern. For centuries, black writers, thinkers, and artists have fought for a space in the cultural conversation, only to be denied or relegated to secondary status. This struggle is about more than just one individual's fight for visibility, it is about the continued marginalization of entire communities, the erasure of histories, and the silencing of voices that have long had something important to say. The writer's work, though overlooked by many, became a powerful tool for resistance. It was not only a commentary on the state of America but a quiet revolution in itself. Each word, each sentence, was an act of defiance, a refusal to accept a world that had long relegated black people to the status of invisible subjects. The writer had written not for personal fame, but to give voice to the voiceless, to chart a path through a society that sought to erase their presence. Their work was a mirror to the struggle for dignity, for recognition, and for justice that would define the next generations of black thinkers and activists. In a sense, the writer's silence became part of the ongoing story of resistance. They were not the first black writer to be silenced by societal forces, nor would they be the last. But what set this writer apart was the way their absence became a symbol of the larger cultural forces at play. The writer's name, though rarely spoken, became synonymous with the erasure of black intellectualism. The mere fact of their absence, the fact that their work had been ignored, dismissed, or forgotten by many, became a powerful commentary on the way that America had historically treated its black citizens. Yet, this absence, this silence, also had a paradoxical effect. It gave rise to a kind of underground reverence for the writer. Scholars and activists, those whose work had long been linked to the struggle for racial justice, began to recognize the writer's work as a vital piece of the larger cultural conversation. They began to see the value in the writer's words, not just as literature, but as history, as an essential part of the story of Black America. The writer's absence from the mainstream canon became a rallying cry for those who sought to reclaim the history that had been lost, and in doing so, their work began to find a new audience. The quiet resurgence of the writer's influence was not without its challenges. Even as new generations of scholars and activists began to recognize the importance of their work, there remained a powerful resistance to fully acknowledging the writer's place in the history of American literature. This resistance was not just about a refusal to recognize the writer's genius, it was about a refusal to confront the deeper, more uncomfortable truths that the writer's work represented. The writer's stories were a challenge to the foundations of American society, a society built on racial oppression, economic exploitation, and cultural denial. To fully embrace the writer's work would require a reckoning with these truths, a reckoning that many were unwilling to face. Despite these obstacles, the writer's work continued to inspire those who understood its significance. The writer's legacy, though threatened by decades of neglect, lived on in the hearts and minds of those who had discovered their words. The writer's silence had not erased their power, it had only added to the mystique of their legacy. They had become a symbol of the quiet, enduring power of resistance, a reminder that even in silence, a voice can be heard. This section of the story is about the complexities of memory, legacy, and the struggle for recognition. It is about how a writer's work can survive even in the face of erasure, how their influence can continue to reverberate long after they have been silenced. The writer's legacy was never just about being included in the official narrative of American literature, it was about something much deeper, the quiet, unacknowledged impact that their words had on the people who needed them most. In the end, the writer's legacy is not just about the literary world, it is about the way that the struggle for recognition, for visibility, and for justice continues to shape the culture of a nation. As time passed, the writer's absence began to draw attention in unexpected ways. What had once been an intentional withdrawal from the public eye, a retreat that had been necessary for survival, for mental preservation, and for the exhaustion that came with the weight of being a voice of resistance, slowly began to transform into a focal point for a growing wave of cultural reawakening. It was during this period that the writer's legacy, once all but forgotten, began to resurface with a quiet but undeniable force. The writer, though largely absent from the spotlight, had never been entirely erased. Even in their silence, their influence was embedded in the consciousness of those who had been moved by their words. Activists, intellectuals, and even ordinary people who had absorbed the message within the writer's works began to revisit them. This growing sense of rediscovery was not merely a revisiting of old works, it was a reclaiming of a lost narrative, a struggle to ensure that the work and voice of a black author who had once been rejected, then forgotten, would not be relegated to history's shadows. The resurgence of interest in the writer's works was a response to a larger cultural shift, a moment of reckoning for a country that had long ignored or silenced its black voices. The civil rights movement had ignited a national conversation about race, justice, and equality, but it was not until much later that the deeper intellectual and artistic contributions of black writers, thinkers, and artists were fully recognized. As the writer's works began to be rediscovered, a larger movement for the reclamation of black intellectualism took root. It became clear that their words had not only shaped a generation of activists but had also laid the groundwork for the next wave of thinkers, writers, and scholars who would continue the fight for racial equality and representation. The writer's rediscovery was not just about an academic revival, it was about a cultural reclamation. Their work began to be read not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a living document, a testament to the power of literature to engage with the deepest social issues of the time. Scholars, critics, and educators began to look back at the writer's body of work with fresh eyes. What had once been dismissed as a niche or race-specific genre was now seen as essential reading, both in its historical context and for its radical critique of American society. The very qualities that had once led to the writer's rejection, their unflinching honesty, their refusal to conform to literary norms, their challenging of white supremacy and social injustice, were now being seen as essential contributions to the larger American literary tradition. This rediscovery was not an overnight phenomenon, nor was it a singular event. It happened in fits and starts, in pockets of the literary world, and in activist circles. The writer's works began to appear in anthologies of African American literature, and their name, once obscure, began to gain recognition once again. The writer's voice, once silenced by the forces of cultural suppression, was now being embraced as a key voice in the struggle for racial justice, intellectual freedom, and artistic integrity. This was not simply a story of an individual coming back into the light, it was the story of an entire cultural history that had been overlooked, ignored, or suppressed, coming to the surface. In the academic world, the resurgence of the writer's legacy coincided with a broader rethinking of what American literature truly was. The canon, long dominated by white male voices, began to be re-evaluated and expanded. The writer's works, once dismissed as peripheral or irrelevant, were now seen as central to understanding the American experience. Scholars began to trace the connections between the writers' work and the larger movements for social change, noting the ways in which their themes of resistance, survival, and identity had influenced generations of Black writers, intellectuals, and activists. The writers' refusal to be silenced, their unflinching commitment to speaking truth to power, had laid the groundwork for the kind of literary revolution that was beginning to take shape in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. However, this rediscovery was not without its tensions. The writer's absence, though now understood as an act of resistance, left behind a complicated legacy. What had been lost during the writer's period of obscurity? How had the silencing of their voice impacted the broader understanding of American history, literature, and culture? These were difficult questions to confront. The writer's legacy had not simply been forgotten by the mainstream literary world. It had been intentionally erased, pushed to the margins in favor of voices that upheld the dominant cultural narrative. The struggle to reclaim the writer's place in the literary canon was, in many ways, a struggle against the very systems that had sought to suppress them. The awakening of the writer's legacy also intersected with the broader struggle for racial justice. As the country reckoned with the long history of Black exclusion, oppression, and marginalization, the writer's voice, once dismissed, then forgotten, became a symbol of the broader fight for recognition and equality. Their work was more than just a critique of American society, it was a call to action, a challenge to the status quo. By rediscovering and reclaiming the writer's legacy, a new generation of activists and thinkers was reaffirming the importance of Black intellectualism and art in shaping the future of the nation. This process of rediscovery and reclamation was also deeply personal for many of those involved. For Black readers, scholars, and activists, the writer's work was not just an intellectual exercise, it was a return to something that had been stolen from them. The writer's voice, long relegated to the sidelines, was now being acknowledged as part of the shared cultural heritage of the Black community. The rediscovery of their work was a return to a conversation that had been cut off, a chance to revisit the past and understand how it had shaped the present. In this way, the rediscovery of the writer's work was not just an academic pursuit, it was a cultural reclamation, a way of asserting the value of Black voices in the ongoing story of American identity. The writer's influence, once relegated to small circles, was now reaching a broader, more diverse audience. New generations of Black writers and artists began to draw inspiration from the writer's courage and their unyielding commitment to speaking truth. The writer's work became a touchstone for those engaged in the ongoing struggle for racial justice and equality, reminding them that the fight for recognition was not new, but had been fought by generations before them. The writer's rediscovery served as a reminder that the struggle for visibility and recognition was ongoing and that the fight for cultural inclusion and representation must continue. By the end of this period of rediscovery, the writer's legacy was firmly re-established. Their name, once consigned to the edges of literary history, had once again become synonymous with courage, resistance, and intellectual integrity. What had begun as an isolated effort to reclaim the writer's work had grown into a broader movement, one that sought to reframe the very foundations of American literature. The writer, whose voice had once been silenced by the forces of racism and cultural erasure, had finally found their rightful place in the history of American letters. This awakening, however, was not the end of the story. The work of reclaiming the writer's legacy was ongoing, as new generations of readers and scholars continue to engage with their work, to build upon it, and to ensure that the writer's voice, like so many others, is never silenced again. The rediscovery of the writer's legacy was not just a triumph for the individual, but for the broader cultural movement that had fought for visibility, recognition, and justice for Black people in America. It was a testament to the enduring power of art and literature to shape the future, to challenge the status quo, and to tell the stories that history has so often forgotten. Despite the writer's resurgence in the public eye, a sense of fragility surrounded their legacy, one that seemed both eternal and impermanent. The rediscovery of their work had been a quiet revolution, a reclamation of lost history and silenced voices, but it also illuminated the broader vulnerabilities of cultural memory. History is often shaped not just by what is remembered but by what is allowed to disappear, to fade into obscurity or be erased altogether. The writer's life and legacy, once dismissed and then rediscovered, revealed the fragile and fleeting nature of the recognition they had fought so hard for. In many ways, the final chapter of their story, The Vanishing Point, was not marked by physical absence but by the increasingly fragile grip of memory itself. The writer's public disappearance had always been a mystery, a deliberate act of retreat into silence, but this vanishing was not entirely voluntary. It was a disappearance enforced by a society that had never fully embraced them, that had pushed them into the margins, erased their history, and continued to deny their rightful place in the story of American literature. The very fact that their work had been forgotten for so long pointed to the deeper forces of cultural erasure at play. It was not just the individual writer who had vanished, it was the entire tradition of black literary voices that had been systematically marginalized or ignored. And when that voice began to re-emerge, it did so under the shadow of a long history of invisibility. The writer's disappearance mirrored a pattern that had been repeated countless times in the lives of other black writers and intellectuals. For every writer who had been pushed aside, ignored, or erased, there were others whose contributions were overlooked because they did not fit the acceptable mold of what it meant to be an author, a thinker, or an artist in America. The writer's experience was not unique, but it was particularly poignant. Their absence, once seen as a simple withdrawal, was now recognized as the result of a cultural failure to acknowledge and preserve the voices that had always challenged the dominant narrative. As the writer's legacy re-emerged, it became clear that their vanishing was not an isolated event, but part of a much larger story of racial exclusion and historical forgetting. While the resurgence of the writer's works had been celebrated by scholars and activists, a lingering question remained: would the writer's legacy be permanent, or would it once again be swept away by the currents of time? The fight to ensure that the writer's work and contributions would be remembered was not a simple one. It was, in many ways, a battle against the forces of historical amnesia, against a society that was all too willing to forget the uncomfortable truths about its past. The writer's work had been silenced not because it lacked merit, but because it forced America to confront its own moral contradictions. The question that loomed over the writer's legacy was whether, in the long run, their works would be remembered, or whether, like so many others before them, they would again be relegated to the shadows. In the broader context of racial justice and historical reckoning, the writer's work began to be understood as not just a personal story but a reflection of the larger struggle for black voices to be heard in a country that had long been reluctant to acknowledge them. This broader recognition gave the writer's legacy a renewed significance. Their works were no longer seen as isolated pieces of literature, but as critical parts of the ongoing cultural conversation about race, power, and justice. The writer had, in many ways, become an emblem of that larger fight. Their disappearance, like their eventual rediscovery, became symbolic of the erasure and recovery of black cultural memory in America. Yet, the fragile nature of cultural memory continued to cast a shadow over the writer's legacy. The process of rediscovery, while powerful, could not guarantee permanence. A legacy is not something that can be forced into existence by scholarly articles, political movements, or activists alone. It is something that requires constant attention, maintenance, and nurturing. The writer's work had been resurrected from the grave of obscurity, but the question remained whether the world would continue to remember them or allow their voice to slip away once again. For every effort to keep their memory alive, there were still forces at work in the world, in academia, in the media, and in society at large, that would rather let the writer's legacy fade into the background, allowing history to forget the uncomfortable truths they had voiced. The fragility of the writer's legacy was not just a matter of forgetting. It was about the potential for deliberate erasure. In a world where history is so often rewritten to serve those in power, the writer's contributions to American literature were always at risk of being dismissed as irrelevant or radical. The writer's unflinching critique of American society, its systems of racial inequality, its exploitation of black people, and its refusal to confront its own moral failings, had always made them a controversial figure. The writer's work had been silenced, in part, because it had forced America to confront the darkest parts of its soul. And now, even as their legacy was being resurrected, there were still forces that sought to minimize the significance of that work, to reframe it in ways that would neutralize its power. The struggle to preserve the writer's memory was not just a personal battle, it was a larger cultural struggle for justice and visibility. It became increasingly clear that the preservation of the writer's work was not simply about ensuring that they received recognition for their literary achievements, it was about ensuring that the history of Black intellectualism was not lost. The writer's works were part of a larger tapestry, a history of resistance, of fighting against the erasure of Black voices in every realm of cultural production. To allow the writer's work to fade once again would be to perpetuate the cycle of historical invisibility that had defined the Black experience in America for centuries. The challenge was not just about ensuring that the writer's book stayed in print or that their name was mentioned in academic circles. It was about ensuring that their story, the story of a Black writer who had risen from the depths of racial oppression to become a formidable literary force, was a story that continued to be told, shared, and remembered by future generations. If the writer's story were allowed to fade, it would be more than just a loss for literature, it would be a loss for the entire struggle for racial equality and cultural recognition. As the years passed, the struggle for the writer's legacy continued. The writer's disappearance, once seen as a personal withdrawal, was now understood as part of a larger, systemic pattern of erasure. The writer had been silenced not just by personal choice but by the forces of history and culture that sought to exclude, deny, and forget. In the end, the question of legacy is always tied to memory, and memory is a fragile thing. It can be shaped, distorted, and erased by those who hold power. For the writer, as for so many others, the fight to ensure that their legacy would not be lost to time was an ongoing battle, one that continues to be waged today. The vanishing point was not just the moment of disappearance, it was the point at which the writer's story could have been lost forever. But the fight for their legacy, for their memory, for their place in history, ensured that the writer's story would endure. The writer had disappeared, but they had never truly gone away. Their voice, though silenced for a time, had always carried the weight of truth, and in that truth lay the power to reshape the cultural landscape for generations to come. The writer's work had never been more relevant, and it was this enduring relevance that would ensure their place in the history they had so boldly confronted.